Really? That looks dangerous. This looks like a health and safety nightmare already. Wonderful. There we go.
Marvellous. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. We're here to talk about many things. We've had a brief chat in the green room, and we've realised we could be here all night, so we'll get through as much as we can. But I wanted to start by talking about what libraries meant to me as a young person, and then to ask Cheddar their experience of same. Because when I was a young queer kid growing up in South Wales, my family didn't have any books. We were very working class. And libraries, to me, were a place of sanctuary. They were a place where I could go and feel safe. I was bullied a lot as a kid. And I'd go to the library and feel safe. And I also find friends there in the form of books. And I think that shaped me very much as a young person. And I think that libraries also provide a place where you can learn if you don't have access to that information. And as members of the queer communities, we often don't have the access to the information because it's not taught in schools. It certainly wasn't when I was a kid. And then Section 28 came along and it became even harder. So I wondered what Cheddar's experience was of first going to a library and what it meant to you.
Do you know, I remember the ritual of going to the library. And do you know, because similarly, like, I know that I speak incredibly poshly sometimes, but and I know, yeah, you got the joke. But for me, like, drag is actually a real transcendence of things like class, in the same way that it can disrupt our ideas of gender, it can disrupt ideas of class. And I'm from Birmingham, which you only tend to hear when I'm around my mum, if I'm honest with you, or when I start to talk about Birmingham. And so similarly, from a quite working class background, we had do you know, like one of those old school encyclopedias?
Yeah.
We had one of them. And that's the book I can remember being at home, and then my dad's motorcycle books. And that was kind of all we had. And I remember the ritual every week of going to the library and going to that kind of like, that sort of space where you were meant to grab new knowledge and get new things. But for me, it was really a place where I was able to access comic books, science fiction, those kind of fantastical stories of people and places that seem to transcend the ordinary, the everyday. And I think there's a real powerful thing there for queer people, because you realise that there are all these potential different ways of being that don't look like the world that we necessarily grow up in. And so I remember my mum saying to me, and she said, which she doesn't only say to me, she says to other people, she always says when she meets somebody new and they know me through drag, they go, "We don't know where Michael came from." and I think, because Michael's my other name, and I think I came from that space. I came from the stories I was able to access through places like the library. And they've always been, there aren't many places you can go that are in public and safe to go that don't involve drinking or taking drugs or, you know, feeling in a precarious way. And I think for me, and particularly when I was writing as I became a grown-up, and I don't know whether this resonates with your experience, the library was always this really calm, beautiful space where I was able to force myself to apply myself to do the things that really mattered. And I don't know whether those two things are linked in my life.
I think they possibly are. I think they possibly are. I also think that, I mean, during the 80s, I came out in 1985. I went to my first Pride March, which was the Pride March in the film Pride, with the Welsh miners, which I'd escaped from, so I was a bit disappointed that there were Welsh miners there at the time, but I look back now and realise how important it was, of course. But I remember at that time there was, the Thatcher government was closing lots of libraries, and I've always felt that that's a very political act, because libraries are a way for people to get information. And a government that doesn't want you to have information is when you should be very questioning of. And I just wonder how much you think that libraries in some ways are a place of protest as well.
Well, I'll ask you a question about that, because I think there's something interesting. It's an organising space, but before that, and I feel that as we're talking about libraries, we're talking about stories, we're talking about books, we're talking about those things that inspire us. Does anybody know the Philip Pullman books? Yeah, so Philip, the Dark Materials books, right, which it's sad that I think the kind of only queer characters are these angels that die in it, right? So you might identify that as a thing. But what I love about that is the story it tells about knowledge. And it has that idea that knowledge is this real potent, powerful thing, and the authority, the one who seeks to control us, it very literally wants to contain and restrict the flow of knowledge. It's that rewriting of the biblical story of Adam and Eve and Paradise Lost as a result. And I love that idea, and I think it reflects reality, and that's what I love about fantastical stories. So often they're actually telling us about what is happening in our own world and the social dynamics that we find hard to articulate. And so I think literature and libraries by proxy are a space for radical ideas and new inventions of the world. And that is something that people who wish to maintain a status quo, and particularly maintain a restrictive social and economic world in which we're expected to function in a particular way, that is definitely something that those people would want to restrict. And if you look at any fascistic movement, now fascism is a word that I don't use lightly. I think we batter it around so much these days, and I think we perhaps overuse it a little bit. But if you look at any fascistic movement, it tends to involve the restricting of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so it's always on the edges of that. So whilst we might identify fascistic elements in the Thatcher government and indeed our own government, I don't go as far as to call them fascistic, because I think we need that word to describe a very particular situation. But you can see that as those political movements move into fascism, one of the key things is about managing the stories by which we find meaning in our lives. And it's classical with book burnings, with what Hitler did in Germany. And indeed what happened on the inverse for Stalin in the USSR. You have that control of knowledge is so critically important. And that has real particular implications for queer people, because quite often our lives are the ones that are deemed to be stories not worth preserving. Indeed, stories that haven't necessarily been written down or openly spoken about, but then also provide a different kind of story, which is the scapegoat story, the story of blame, the thing that we can identify in religious text and go, that's the problem, they're the problem. And that acts as if you like, a shield for us being able to see what the real issue is, which is the people who seek to control us and control the narrative in the beginning.
When I was a kid, there weren't YA books aimed at LGBT kids. There weren't any books really. And the first time that I read a book in which I really recognised myself, I'd read books in which there were queer people. I'd read Jenny because I was obsessed with David Bowie, and that introduced me to Jenny. But I was quite intrigued, but also quite scared by Jenny.
Which one? Which one did you read first?
Flowers, Our Lady of the Flowers.
Our Lady of the Flowers.
Because I saw Lindsay Kemp's production, which blew my mind. But the first book that I read that I actually felt seen was Tales of the City by Armistead Motham when I was 22, which I was actually on a good read yesterday talking about that book, because it changed my life, because I'd never read a book before in which people like me were given a voice. And I think all too often we're silenced, and that silencing, the fact that as queer people, when you're a young kid, there's a singer called David McCallum, some of you may know, who's a friend of mine. We did a podcast together last year, and he made a really great comment where he said, everyone talks about the moment when we come out. No one talks about going in. And there's a moment when you're a child where you go in, you suddenly become aware that your behaviour and the way you're speaking and behaving is not acceptable to the adults around you, and you go in, and there's a silencing that happens there. And books, for me, were a way of sort of overcoming that silence.
Definitely. Do you know what I was thinking about when you were saying that? I was thinking about the books that were not allowed to read. And I was at Hay Festival on Sunday, and we did a panel about queer literature and the role it had played in shaping our lives. And we talked about like the naughty section of the library.
Yeah.
Do you ever remember that? And like sneaking into the naughty section of the library, the bit that you're like kind of not allowed to access. And I always relate it immediately to fantasy stories, because you'll find with me I do everything. I relate everything to a fantastical story. And like if you think of any kind of fantastical area of fiction, there's always this hidden part of the magical library where the dangerous books are kept, the dark and dangerous magic. And I feel almost for a long time queer literature was like placed in that zone, right? It was that thing. And obviously now we're having this moment of dispersal where you have, things like Heartstopper. Do you know what I mean? It's a graphic novel mainstream graphic novel being put out alongside other graphic novels, that's remarkable. But there is a part of me that misses like the dangerous territory. And I think, and I mean that like very seriously, because I think there is absolutely a place for it. Because the risk is that you go, the acceptable queerness, the stuff that we're willing to let children see and young adults see and all that stuff, which is great. You know, you have a toned down version of what's deemed to be age-appropriate queerness in fiction. Love that. And I think there's absolutely a place for that. But the risk is that that comes to define what is acceptable in queer literature. And as a result, you lose the dangerous space, which is really important as a place to find boundary, to discuss difficult topics, to speak about trauma, to speak about sexuality. You end up losing that because it's almost seen as that's the queerness that you ban. And I think the stuff that seeps into mainstream libraries and mainstream narratives tends to be the stuff about queer people that the mainstream finds easy to process and wants to agree with, and they think they already understand about queer people's lives. So I think there's a place for that other excessiveness. The first queer book that I really, well, I think is like, you know, an overtly queer book was probably Quentin Crisp's Naked Civil Servant for me. But you know what? Do you know when you say Genet, I'm sure I read Genet before that, because those books are just so beautiful. And I was always interested, because do you hear that story that Jean Genie by David Bowie is about Jean Genet, right?
Of course, yeah.
And I think there's so much music that was inspired by Jean Genet. That kind of culture is woven into everything. That literature is woven into all of our culture. I don't know whether you asked a question, whether I answered one, or whether I've just gone on. Sorry.
You did talk about something there that I wanted to pick up on, which is this idea of there being a designated space for these books, because running the literary salon that I run and the prize and being an author since the 90s, I've seen a lot of changes in the way that book selling happens. And there was a period where certain chains, I won't name them, would suddenly have a gay section, then it was a gay and lesbian, then it was LGBT section. And I was always in two minds about that, because on the one hand, I wanted to be in that section because I wanted people looking for stories about people like them to find my books. But I also wanted to be in the mainstream section. And because of my surname, I'm usually between Candice Bushnell and William Burroughs, which is quite a nice place to be. You know, I quite like being there. I wondered what your thoughts were, because I think nowadays we're seeing less of that in the chains.
Category, yeah. I mean, I'm in a library. I shouldn't bitch about category, right? Because there's going to be librarians throwing things at me. And particularly the expansion of queerness, I have a lot to say on this, because I think there's something about having a space that is for that which is excessive of normative category, including LGBT-ness. And I'm really interested in what that space is, and that's why I talk about the dangerous books, the really dangerous books, because in the past, the LGBT literature was all lumped as being part of the outside, and it would have been with the books that were about prostitutes and gangsters and tattoo artists and other, you know, things that used to be deemed incredibly, and punks and the like, and hippies, you know, things that were deemed outside of the normative. And in some sense, all of that stuff is queer, that which is outside of the normative world, and that which is deemed to be appropriate and acceptable. And you see this kind of the inclusion of things and pulled into the normative world. But what I often worry about is that the only way we're pulled in is by conforming to very strict ideas of what identity is. And that is based around static category and the idea that you are gay and that is the way you are, or that you are trans and that is the way you are. And I think a lot of that idea of how identity works comes from quite a dark bit of queer history, which is about the criminalising and pathologising of different kinds of queerness. And for me, I love having those spaces, and I think those spaces within our world are so important because we need them in order to survive. We're in a world that demands category from us in order to survive. Everyone, not just queer people, right? We all, to a certain extent, have to conform to those senses of who we are and articulating our identity in particular ways. But I think there is definitely a value of still having that amorphous area where we can explore new ideas. And that's why I worry about sometimes being pulled too much into a category.
Yeah.
Because there are so many different ways to be gay, and there are so many different ways to be trans, and there's a quality of that that's lost, and particularly when certain dominant narratives end up dominating those particular literary spaces. Once again, I think I might have waffled on and not answered.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. There was a moment in the late 80s. I moved to London in 1985, and I remember there was a police raid on Gay's the Word, which was at that point one of the few gay bookshops in the country. And they took away books that, were imported books that would probably be called pornography. But they also took away books that were perfectly innocent books that would be found in any other bookshop. But because they were in Gay's the Word, they were deemed pornographic by virtue of where they were found.
By association.
Yeah, exactly. Just by rubbing up against the wrong spine of the bookshelf.
I'd like to run my hands again along all of the books in the library so that they are all now perverted by my touch. Ideology. It's a hand of ideology rubbing against all of the books.
But it was there that I first heard Armistead Maupin read from Tales of the City, and this is my segue into my little reading I'm going to give, because the gentleman that introduced me to Armistead Maupin was a guy called Vaughan Michael Williams, who was my landlord and flatmate, and the first person that I ever knew who was diagnosed positive and subsequently died of AIDS. And when I wrote this memoir, which is called We Can Be Heroes, the turning point in the memoir, it deals a lot with my childhood trauma growing up at the time that I did, and in the family that I did, which was very dysfunctional. But the turning point in my story was when Vaughan was diagnosed, and I went from being this frightened kid who'd never had a fight, never fought back in my life, never threw a punch, to being someone who had to fight. So I'm going to read just a very short extract just to give you a flavour, because it also links with this, which I know Cheddar has also got something to say about.
I've forgotten.
Silence equals death, darling.
Yes,
We talked about it.
Point to the T-shirt, yes. I remember that.
So I'm just going to read you a little short bit from We Can Be Heroes, and this is it's the middle chapter roughly, it's chapter 13. All you need to know is that I'm living with my cousin, who's called Elaine, in a place called Blackheath in South London, and that Vaughan has just told me that he's positive. So this is chapter 13, and it's called We Can Be Heroes. December the 1st, 1989, World AIDS Day. An unmarked white van is slowly snaking its way through Parliament Square towards Westminster Bridge. The driver is an ex-military man called Alan. Packed in the back are a dozen men and women, none of us from a military background, all of us personally embattled in one way or another. Halfway across the bridge, the van suddenly stops. The rear doors fly open and we jump out carrying a thick iron chain. Dodging the traffic, we padlock the chain to either side of the bridge before handcuffing ourselves to it and tossing the keys into the Thames below. Some of us are holding bunches of flowers, the kind you might place on a loved one's grave. We link arms as a show of solidarity and begin our protest. ACT UP, fight back, fight AIDS. I joined ACT UP shortly after Vaughan told me he was positive. By the time I was chaining myself to Westminster Bridge some 10 months later, it had completely taken over my life. Some people found this hard to deal with, but Elaine understood. She was there for me when many others weren't. ACT UP stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. There was no formal structure or hierarchy, rather a variety of subgroups dedicated to direct action, fundraising, media liaison, and so on. I volunteered to join the action group. Not everyone could afford to get arrested. Some had family to think about or jobs to protect, but everyone was equally welcome. Some made placards or banners for our actions. Others acted as legal observers. Archived photographs from the time tend to show angry gay men in black leather biker jackets. There were certainly a fair few of them, myself included, but there were also lots of women in ACT UP. Stacey Baker, Shay Feeney, Emma Hindley, Jo Mackey, and Maureen Oliver, to name just a few. Most were lesbians. Statistically, lesbians remain one of the lowest risk groups in terms of the transmission of HIV, but many were personally affected by the crisis or felt a strong sense of solidarity with gay men. As was often asked at the time, had the situation been reversed, Would gay men have stepped up in quite the same way? I'm not quite sure they would have. At that first meeting, I met a beautiful young biker boy called Spud Jones, who became my closest friend. As I soon discovered, activism can be a powerful bonding agent. Spud was the singer in a band called Tongue Man, who released punky, noisy, unapologetically queer records with titles like Joys of a Meat Master. He was never destined to appear on Top of the Pops. But another member of ACT UP often did. Jimmy Somerville had been part of the soundtrack to my life from Small Town Boy through to his recent hit Don't Leave Me This Way, the Communards' cover of a disco classic interpreted by many as a tribute to those lost to AIDS. ACT UP was committed to non-violent direct action, sometimes referred to as civil disobedience, otherwise known as breaking the law. The aim wasn't simply to vent our anger, though for me this was part of the attraction, but to raise awareness of the issues affecting people living with HIV and AIDS, be they welfare cuts, discrimination in the workplace, homophobic reporting in the press, and so on. Demonstrations were referred to as ZAPs and tended to be rather theatrical in nature. For example, ACT UP New York famously staged an enormous die-in at St. Patrick's Cathedral and stormed the offices of politicians and drug companies, covering desks and computers with fake blood. ACT UP Paris lowered a giant pink condom over the Egyptian obelisk in the city centre. It's fair to say that ACT UP London never reached such dizzy heights. Our first ZAP involved catapulting condoms over the walls of Pentonville Prison. When it became clear that rubbers wrapped in foil didn't have the density required to scale prison walls, we inflated the condoms and tried to float them over instead. We also chained ourselves to the gates of Downing Street on the day the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Major, was due to deliver his budget. As his car approached, a group of us leapt out and handcuffed ourselves to the gates, blocking his path. My photo appeared in one of the papers under the headline, "Not Budging on Budget Day." 5 people were arrested and referred to as the ACT UP 5. I loved it. Another time, we invaded the offices of the Daily Mail, cunningly disguised as motorcycle couriers. The target of our protest was columnist George Gale, who peddled the kind of victim-blaming AIDS commentary typical of this period. I was sporting rather a luxurious quiff at the time and questioned whether a motorcycle helmet was really necessary, as it might flatten my hair. My friend Emma rolled her eyes, reminding me this was no time for vanity. Photographs taken inside the offices show Emma, Jimmy, and me handcuffed to some railings, while a security guard looks on, perplexed. But mainly, we blocked traffic. As my fellow activist and soon-to-be boyfriend William often said, our battle cry could have been, "ACT UP London, lie down." Joking aside, this was one way to guarantee media coverage. If all else failed, we'd make the traffic news. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you, Cheddar, about a sort of cross-generational conversation, really, about silence equals death and what that meant then, because I remember very vividly, although there was lots of community fundraising and lots of good initiatives, and without them we wouldn't have Terence Higgins Trust and various charities, there was an awful lot of stigma and a lot of victim blaming, even within our own community. And Spud, who I mentioned there, who was a very beautiful man, we were talking earlier in the green room, after his first hospitalization, when he came out, he'd lost a lot of weight and looked quite gaunt, and he didn't want to go out. And I insisted on taking him to his favourite bar, Compton's in Soho, and somebody came over and said, "What the hell happened to you? You used to be so good looking." And he never went out again. And I would like to think that those attitudes are no longer around, but I fear that they may still be to some degree.
I feel like they are. I hope that they're less. Certainly they are in the groups of people I orientate myself around. But what I wanted to talk to you about, and see how I flip your question again, was the cross-generational state of activism. And I think there's something really, really interesting that's happened in the last kind of 20 years to do with activism. And now when I did the look on Drag Race, which I'm incredibly proud of, and was one of the most, for me, one of the most rewarding experiences of drag that I've ever been involved in. You know, I received a lot of messages.
It was a very powerful moment.
It meant a huge amount. It meant a huge amount to me that it meant so much to so many people. Because I struggle with drag, you know what I mean? I'm quite a serious person. I know you're shocked. But I'm quite a serious person, right? Or at least I like to think I'm quite a serious person. And for me, sometimes I struggle with the flippant nature, the way drag is often regarded. And so like I latch onto anything that I feel gives it a little bit more gravitas, sometimes in quite an irritating, kind of sacrimonious kind of way. But one of the things I loved about that is that it felt like I did something that was really worthwhile. But what I always say when the word activist was used such a huge amount towards me, when that happened. And people still now say to me, you're such an activist, you're such an activist. You're such an activist. And I always say to them, an activist is a person who gets absolutely no attention, works incredibly hard, and the only point they get attention is when they're arrested, right? And I feel that what I do, yeah, sure, it has an element of that in it, in terms of it did some good in the world. It's not activism. Do you know what I mean? It is it's a good story to tell, and I'm a storyteller. Yeah. I get a huge amount of attention in my life, and I get a huge amount of positive attention in my life. And I think now activism, unfortunately, is so reduced to the moments that we speak loudly in order to get some positive attention for it. Or we get positive attention as a result of it. Do you know what I mean? It becomes a moment of showing your worthiness. And that's not to say that the activism has no value whatsoever, but I feel like there are very few people who are involved with particular digital campaigns who are working away in that quiet way. They are there, but we don't ever see them until they get arrested. And I'm not sure that there is that same verve and determination for the issues that are kind of plaguing our communities now. There are people willing to place themselves in harm's way in the same way that your generation did.
I did an event last night at the British Library, and there was a woman there who was a couple of years older than me, in her early 60s, and she was asking, we were showing some pictures from ACT UP, and there were lots of pictures of us being arrested and so on, and she was saying, what would your advice be to young people now? Because even though we were breaking the law, and I was arrested many, many times, and the police didn't come on gay pride marches wearing lanyards. They kicked us and shoved us and wore rubber gloves, and it was horrendous. But I I only got prosecuted one time, and I actually won the case because I had a really good witness at the time, and I got off. But nowadays, because of the way that the system is changing, I'm not sure how I would do that. I'm not sure how I would do that now, physically.
Do you know what I just thought in my mind? It literally just came to me. I was like, sitting. What's one of the big problems that we're dealing with at the moment? It's like bathroom stuff, right? Like stuff like that, which should be quite trivial. What about a shitting? Right? A shitting, where we all go to the wrong bathroom and have a shit. Right? Like, let's make it like real. What would be the equivalent civil disobedience for the kind of restriction, particularly we're seeing in the States at the moment? What would be the equivalent act of rebellion that kind of borders that place, which is breaking the law but isn't really doing any harm, right? And I feel we don't really have any of those things happening. We have marches which tend to be cleared with the police and organised, and occasionally they'll break out and, you know, go down a road they're not supposed to. Ooh, and the traffic will be disruptive. It's, no, like somebody, there was a bus there, there was an entire bus of people stopped. Ooh. And I don't think we have that same spirit at the moment. But I think that if and as conditions worsen, hopefully that spirit is enlivened. But I do worry sometimes that so much of our movement, so much of our thought and so much of our energy has become funneled through very specific corporately owned platforms that don't allow us that kind of movement, and even the very idea in our imaginations that we could take such direct action like a shit-in. So you heard it here first. I want to see it like... You're ready for it, aren't you? We'll do it. Let's do a shit-in somewhere that's like banned trans women from a loo or something.
I do think there's a tendency, going back to what you were saying about activism, that there is a tendency for some people who think that just ranting on Twitter all day is activism, and that isn't activism to me. But I do think that activism can take many forms, and when I left ACT UP, because I was in it for like 5-6 years, and then I was involved in Outrage, which was like Queer Nation, and then I got burnout because basically I buried all my friends and I just couldn't cope anymore. and I became a journalist. But for me, my journalism was activism, because back in those days, in the early 90s, there were no gay voices in mainstream newspapers. I mean, there were gay writers, but they weren't writing as openly gay writers. There weren't gay columnists. And I worked for Time Out magazine, which at that point was the only magazine read by the mainstream that had a regular gay column in it, and that was my job. It was rather a bitter pill, because I got that job at a tender age because the person who held that job had died of AIDS, and that really hung heavily on me at the time. But I did regard that job as activism, and I do regard running my salon and the prize as activism, because they're providing platforms to amplify voices that would otherwise not be heard. So I think activism can take many different forms. It doesn't need to be street activism to be activism.
It's almost like there's a distinction as well between the space of organisation and amplification and the space of direct action.
Yeah.
Right? And I feel like in some ways we're very good at the space of organisation and amplification when it comes to online stuff, and it's absolutely important. Like I said, I am so proud of how much attention that look got on the show and how much space it was given. But how does that translate? How do we translate attention into action? And I think that's going to be one of the real things that we have to face now as a generation moving forward. And bringing it back to actually libraries, you mentioned like the queer bookshops, and obviously like libraries wouldn't necessarily at that point have been a space of organisation for queer people, even if they may on a personal level be a space of freedom and a place that we found freedom. But I think I look at the current situation around Drag Queens Reading Time, and ironically, you know what, the libraries are kind of staying true to it. They've got people outside shouting paedophile at drag queens who come in to read children's stories about princesses. I find this, so this is like very funny to me. I just did a show at the weekend about a cowboy, and I find it very funny that like some parents, not by any means all parents or a majority of parents, some parents find it problematic a child going to see a drag queen read a story, or even, heavens forbid, their child dressing up in drag or cross-dressing in some way. Oh, you know, lordy me. And yet they'll happily give their child a gun and say, go and hunt the indigenous person.
Yeah.
Do it. But libraries, I think, are peculiarly becoming a territory of that kind of direct action and conflict, because the library staff and the library organisers and the event organisers, for the time being, are kind of holding their ground on that and tolerating protesters and organising counter-protests for these odd little events, which like a few years back, God, they were just so minimal, Drag Queen Reading Time here in the UK. It was like a little incidental part, and it feels actually like the industry grew in response to the objection to it, because all of a sudden libraries were like, we're going to have a drag queen reading because there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And that, I think that is something to be applauded about libraries, and I hope that allyship remains with cultural spaces like libraries. I mean, just even the hosting of this event, I mean, look at this amazing wonderful place that we're in. This kind of, what century was it? 15th century this is from. You know, I mean,
and they've let us on here.
It's older than us, darling. It's older than us.
It's older than us combined.
Do you know what I mean? Well, I wouldn't say combined. But to have that happen in these spaces, I just hope that becomes part of that direct action and amplification.
I'd like to go back to your Silence Equals Death dress, because I also think that there was something about that which is to do with communication, because I think one of the things that happened when the AIDS crisis, I mean, AIDS crisis is ongoing, but when people stopped dying in the large numbers they were dying in the mid-90s when the new drugs came along, one of the things that happened is that my generation, who were basically suffering from PTSD, I realise now looking back, but didn't know at the time, and survivor's guilt and all these terrible things, basically escaped into hedonism, many of us. Ecstasy came along and it was like, woo, let's all go and be happy and dance to crazy music, and it was great and fun. And the generation coming up behind didn't know how to approach us to talk about these subjects, because they could see there was trauma there. And also there were a lot of people that were missing, because so much of what I learned as a young gay person, I learned from listening to older gay men, and they weren't there for that generation. And I think what you did with that outfit and making that statement was an invitation to a conversation.
Absolutely. and also a recognition of the way that trauma echoed through our communities. And I think there are absolutely young people who start going out clubbing and who have no experience of the AIDS crisis and no idea what that was all about and won't be educated about it. Yet because of the way that our culture has been so thrown into hedonism, there is this peculiar echo of trauma and the coping strategies that we use for it. And I absolutely believe that young people who have no contact with that era and who have no knowledge even of that era become embroiled in the culture and intersection of shame that is linked to HIV and queer life. And that was one of the things that I thought was really amazing they kept in on the show, was I talked about how I'm a negative person. I'm not a negative person, you know what I mean. I'm a very positive person, but I'm not HIV positive. But as a HIV negative person, growing up with those tombstones, with those things coming down, and like just missing the generation really that was massively affected by it, even though the generation of men that I knew and who were around me when I was growing up on the queer scene, and my second growing up as a young adult, I felt still immersed and part of that. And I think in very subtle ways that travels through the generations of our community, that the potency of that shame that was inflicted upon people, it was weaponized. Shame was weaponized definitely. Towards people. Definitely. And I think that still travels through our communities today amongst people who have no clue about the history itself. I don't know whether that, has anyone ever read Cloud Atlas? Cloud Atlas, sci-fi book. It's like, there's a good film about it made, and that it's meant to be about reincarnation, but I think that's poppycock, whatever the author intended, I don't know. Because in many ways it speaks about the way ideas and ways of seeing the world travel through people, through very, very subtle ways, and travel through different generations in very, very subtle ways. The way that we have learned to relate to one another is a communication strategy laden with trauma. And it so often involves drugs and alcohol and uninhibited sexuality. And don't get me wrong, all of those things can be fun. Until they're not. And I think that's something, particularly if you spend any long period of time on the clubbing scene, you see in ample loads, emphasis on the loads. Because I am also very sex positive, and whenever I talk about this stuff, I do think it's really important to say, like, I'm an incredibly sex positive person. I'm not getting down on liberal sexuality. Like, I am incredibly, Sissy, my good friend, will tell you, I am incredibly liberal. I mean, she doesn't know firsthand, but I am incredibly liberal when it comes to my own sexuality and other people's sexual freedoms. And but I also think that sometimes we think it's the only way we can communicate with one another. And sorry, well, I will let you speak. I appreciate I'm talking a lot. But I recently did a piece of research with George House Trust and Survivors, which has now been renamed to We Are Survivors here in Manchester, about the intersection of chemsex, consent and HIV. And one of the really fascinating things to come from that was when talking to men about why they did chems, in whatever way, shape or form that was, they talked about the importance of a feeling of brotherhood and a feeling of connection. And I just found that really interesting, that this longing for connection through sex. And don't get me wrong, sex can be a great way to connect with people, but I think also we should have other avenues to be able to connect with one another. And that's why I say I feel like we're often led to believe that as gay people, queer people, however you wish to categorize and identify, we're told that the most interesting thing about us is our sexuality or our gender, and therefore the only way we have to relate to one another is that means. And I think that's something we need to work on.
I agree, absolutely. And I do think also that the repercussions of that association with gay sex, with the deadly virus and the shame still resonates. I still meet much younger people who've had similar journeys in terms of their relationship with their sexuality. And in the way that I did, I write a lot in the book about, I went through a period where I wouldn't get tested because all my friends who got tested and positive all died, and the prognosis was so bad. So what was the point of knowing? I didn't want to know. I just refused to get tested. I just assumed I was positive and was as careful as I could be. but occasionally I would go out and get completely hammered to give myself permission to do something that I shouldn't really be doing for my own safety. Do you know what I mean?
I completely
And
know what you
those
mean.
behaviours took a long time to overcome.
Yeah.
Took me a long time to overcome that.
With no condemnation.
Yeah.
Completely know what you mean.
I think we should open it to the audience. I think, is there any time, does anyone like to ask a question?
Yeah, you regulate algorithms and social media platforms, which we don't do. And I think that for me is one of the biggest, most shocking things we will look back upon this era. You've got one side shouting, drag queens are harming children, the other one shouting, religion's harming children. And like the truth is, you know what's harming children is these devices that we give them that literally influence the way their brains work. And it's very scary. But yeah, how do you have a nuanced debate anymore? Because we now live in a world where the way we are encouraged to debate is about an extreme opinion. And the reason why that's happened behaviourally is because it makes more sellable ad space online.
Yeah.
And it's happened very subtly, chemically in our brains. And we're trapped. We're in it. Like everyone talks about the Black Mirror. Like Black Mirror holds no candle to the reality that we are in because we perceive that we are not being controlled. And that's not me being like weird and sci-fi, like there's chips in our brains, like we're literally being controlled. And my main worry is that there is no intention in that control other than amplifying the extremes of positions solely to sell ad space. There's no great, do you know when people talk about the Illuminati and somebody in control, like the more terrifying thing is that there is nobody in control of this. This is just somebody's had a good idea of how to make something more profitable, and that has taken over and not been regulated. And as a result, we're all shouting at each other. And nobody gets it. It's like nobody's having that conversation. I think I just saw some legislation that they're starting to go through in the US, which sounds really, really exciting and really interesting because they're talking about limiting children's access to algorithmically led technology. And obviously, on both sides, on the left and the right, people are in uproar about it because it could be seen to be making it harder for queer kids to access information about queer lives. And then on the other side, the extremist religious side are saying it's making it harder for kids to access this information about extreme ideology that we wish to imprint on them. But of course, the people who are shouting the loudest are those who make money from letting this technology persist. But yeah, it's slightly off topic, but it's interesting. And if we relate this back to libraries and what libraries are as a space, right? And we might critique the way things are categorized and the way that we are encouraged to find our shelf and stick to it, right? But they have far more freedom in terms of wandering through the shelves of a library. You have far more freedom than wandering down the suggested video list of your YouTube.
That's a very good point. Does anyone else have a question? I personally think, when I tour with my literary salon, Polari, we always include, so we often do like, say, 25 dates around the country, and at least 7 of those will be in libraries. And once you create an event and you market an event, it draws people into the library that may not have come otherwise. And so I think sometimes even having things like reading groups or just an event that there's a social aspect. And I think certainly for many, many LGBTQ plus people that I know, the only social spaces that they're familiar with are spaces that are basically for cruising and picking up and dancing and taking.
Libraries are good for that, though.
Yeah. Actually,
so, a very wide tradition of cruising
Travis
in libraries.
Alabanza told me a story about that. When Travis Alabanza was very young, they were in a library and a librarian gave them a copy of Giovanni's Room, and they didn't know why the librarian had given them this, and they realized they were being a good older gay, and they'd spotted something in Travis and gave them this book. But we always do events in libraries, and I think that they're a great way of encouraging people to come into that space and accept that it's treated as their own. Rather ironically, I'm not quite sure why this is, but we usually get positioned, maybe it's because of the way the layout is, in the children's section. So when we're doing our performances and we've got people reading often quite sexually explicit work, we're surrounded by children's books.
Peppa Pig, just here, you know, feel like you should cover her eyes and her ears whilst you're reading out. I'll turn it down. I was going to, do you know what I would say? Scavenger hunt! Do scavenger hunts! I'd love to see like events like that, do you know, that encourage people to come in and have to find something. And then you could teach them even how to do that, how to do the catalogue, how to do the catalogue by using that and kind of going like, this is a game. Gamification, I think, is the way to get kids on board, because they're used to gaming, they're used to collecting rewards, they're used to leveling up, they're used to all of that stuff. And so I'd be like, exploit that narrative. How do you turn visiting a library into a game that's then productive? But I do want to briefly talk about cruising libraries. My PhD work was, my MA work was about cruising, and my PhD work was about sex work and cruising and spaces where those happen. And libraries, classically, were places where gay men particularly went to have sex with one another. And I think it's because it was those spaces where you were allowed to remain and be present and sit down, and you weren't regulated in the same way you might be around a public toilet or a train station. People weren't expecting you to move on. And then they also had access to a private-ish space, you know, in terms of the loo. So whilst this isn't necessarily what I'm suggesting we should encourage the use of libraries for, I'm not saying that.
Don't try this at home, kids.
What's interesting is acknowledging that kind of odd history, that layered history that would have had a very little impact on the regular library visitor. Yet I should imagine for queer people, it's an entire new realm that exists under the surface of the library, which I think is fascinating. But we almost kind of don't want to talk about it because it's so like, oh, we don't want toward. I don't think it happens that much anymore. Like, do you want me to hear the best cruising story about a library I've ever seen?
I think you're going to.
I'm going to tell it. No, because I'm really not that into cruising. Like, so it was never my thing. Like, and I think partially because I made it an academic topic in my mind, probably because I was like secretly sexually curious of it, but actually didn't have the witherall to just do it, you know. And so I turned it into something that was academic. But one of my favourite things I ever photographed, and because you would always find that there would be places where people would write notes and things like that. This is like the 2007 to 2009. So I think the era has changed now. But you would always find like notes scored on walls, phone numbers, that kind of thing, email addresses, whatever it was, as a means of communicating. And I remember going to the All Saints Library in the university, and it was listed as a place online where you could cruise for sex. And went into the toilet, like, so I would go and take photographs of kind of like spaces where people write and things like that. And I was just like, well, I don't understand how anyone's communicating specific times or anything. It's really, really weird. So I was sat in a cubicle and I looked to the side, because it was a tiled toilet. So clearly they could just wipe off anything that was written down on there. And then in the grout between the tiles, people had written messages to one another. And I just thought that is just fascinating, that level of literal subtext to the white polished surface of the tile. Anyway, that's my little...
That makes me, goes back to Genet. That reminds me of Chambre de Mort, where the prisoners are blowing the smoke through the hole in the wall.
Yeah, there's a literary element to the physicality of that space, which I find fascinating. But, you know, definitely one for the naughty section of the books. No, I've got a question.
There's a question here.
Got two, one over there, one over there. You go, my love. Quite traumatic, you might describe that as.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, for a child.
I mean, I think it's a question of proving somehow and rather demonstrating that these voices are the minority. And that means somehow surveying the other people that use the library about what they feel about different events. Because I work with the Arts Council, I have to do that anyway, because that's part of the requirement. You need to provide feedback from audiences and from people that you've worked with to show that there is a demand and there is a need and a hunger for that kind of material. I don't know how you go about doing that within your job. I don't know what you would do. What we do is we hand out forms to people as they come into the event. So maybe you could give people forms as they come into the library. What would you suggest, Cheddar?
Well, there's something that I think is a catch-all solution to most problems in life, and that's lesbian bikers. Right? There's a lot of problems you can throw a lesbian biker at, and I guarantee you it's not going to be a problem for long. And the reason why I say that is, and bikers in general, find your allies within the communities that will support you, and tell them you've had problems with protesters. Because I think it was lesbian bikers, wasn't it, who recently created a wall to protect the children from the abusive shouting of these. And so I was at Dragfest recently which is, a problematic event in many ways, but not for the reasons that the protesters were there. That's an in-joke for the drag queens in the room. But there was a protest outside, and it was only 15 people or something like that, but they were so vocal, and they were shouting paedophile at everyone. That should be an offence.
Yes.
That should be illegal. To shout paedophile at somebody with absolutely no evidence should be illegal. And yet the police took no action. And so I also think there's different levels at which this has to be tackled. For you organising an event, there has to be a literal wall of defence that you can protect the people coming to your library. Because I understand that libraries will want to pull out, not because they think it's wrong, but because they don't want to subject children to trauma, which is a valiant reason to stop your event for a fear of safety of those involved. So there's that level where you need to create a wall of whatever that might be. I do suggest lesbian bikers if you can get in touch with any, because I guarantee you they will not brook anything from anyone. But then it needs to operate also on a civic level with the police. The police need to be taking appropriate action towards those protesters who are inflicting harm on people. Let's be very clear about this. They are shouting, they are abusive towards children. If we want to talk about who is doing abuse to a child, let us talk about that group of people. Because regardless of how you feel about LGBT rights, regardless of how you feel about what is appropriate and inappropriate for a child, to shout abuse at a child should be an offence, which is the final level, which needs to be tackled on a higher legislative level, but we're not doing. And this is the kind of thing we need activism for. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Where we need direct action and complex, nuanced thinking about it, and people who are actually talking about these things in a smart, nuanced way at a legislative level, which they're not at the moment. So, yeah, I empathise with your situation. And thank you for trying to push forward and continue with the event. Sorry.
And there was one more question, I think, was there?
Oh, that Nile over there went gone. You all right? Yet.
Yeah.
Yet. Because that is the worry, right? Yet.
I think that's a very positive note to end on. I think we should draw things to a close. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and please join me in applauding Cheddar Gorgeous.
And please join me in applauding activist and author Lovely Paul here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Go to your library, have a nice time. Serious. They're dead good. Keep them alive, because if you don't go, they'll close. Right? Brutal bottom line. Go to your library, use it as a reading room, use it as a place to access the internet. Go and do it, because if you don't use it, just like my back, I have learned, if you don't use it, you lose it. Seriously, anybody who's aging understands that. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone.